In this series of the last week of Jesus, and we're going day by day. And we saw Tuesday had a lot of events that we had to divide that up several times. Thursday is a long day as well. We are on Wednesday, and the section in Mark is Mark 14, 1 through 11. There's not as much given there about what happened that day. This happens in Bethany, as you notice from the reading there that Kent read for us. And there's going to be this frame type thing that we've talked about before. We mentioned this on Monday. There were two subjects, the fig tree being cursed, and then the cleansing of the temple. And those were in parallel, and then he came back to the fig tree to teach about that. So you have incident A, the cursing of the fig tree, incident B, the cleansing of the temple, and then incident 8:2 is teaching about the fig tree. And that same type of thing is here in this text that we're looking at, Mark 14. In verses 1 and 2, you might sum that up that the Jewish leaders need a traitor, because it says they are looking to arrest him and kill him, but the problem they have is they say it can't be during the festival, can't be during Passover, otherwise there will be a riot of the people. So that's incident A. And then the section 3 through 9 is about this unnamed woman. So how does that relate to incident A? And how is that summed up? And she anoints him for his burial, in a sense. So that's incident B. And then incident A2 is it comes back to that first thing. So you remember 1 and 2, they need somebody to hand Jesus over. They need a traitor. And then verses 10 and 11 is the appearance of a traitor. And Judas Iscariot, who is one of the 12, went off to the chief priest. See, in verse 1, the chief priests and scribes are seeking to arrest him. And then look at verse 10. Judas went off to the chief priest in order to betray them, or betray him to them. And they were delighted because they needed a traitor, and the traitor has appeared. That contrast then between Judas as the traitor and then the woman who anoints Jesus is a contrast between a believer and a traitor. And it makes it worse because Mark says in verse 10, Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, he's the one who will betray. And so, as you think about this, the crowd, and you think about the crowd around Jesus, it appears the crowd has been for Jesus, and so the Jewish leaders are upset that we can't get the crowd against him. And that's what they say there in verse 1 and 2, that we're afraid to do this. I mean, there's a great crowd when he enters in Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. On Monday, when he goes into the temple and teaches, and he calls it a den of robbers, in chapter 11, verse 18, they kept looking for a way to kill him. They were afraid of him. But then it says, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. This enthusiastic crowd. By Monday, they want to have him executed, but it says the whole crowd is listening to him. On Tuesday, the crowd is mentioned 3 times in the text in chapter 11, verse 32, when Jesus asked them about John the Baptist. Is his message from God or from humans? In 11:32, they didn't answer. We don't know. And the text says they were afraid of the crowd because all regarded John as a prophet. And then that parable about the field, the vineyard, the wicked tenants, in 12:12, it says when they realized he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. And then in 12:37, when Jesus is teaching about the Messiah being David's son, from Psalm 110, 12:37 says, and the large crowd was listening to him with delight. So they have a problem with the crowd. They want to arrest him, but they can't because of the crowd. And so Mark is emphasizing they need a traitor in verses 1 and 2. And the narrative logic follows here. They give up, in a sense. We got to do something, it says. They're looking to arrest him secretly or covertly and kill him, but they're saying, we can't do it during the festival. Otherwise, there will be a riot. And so basically, they give up. Now, I kind of want to take a side road here, and this will bring out the action of this woman, this unnamed woman, more. And the side road is Mark presents the 12, the disciples, in a sense of failing Jesus. They just don't get it. Now, we shouldn't look at Mark and say, well, why can't they get it? Because the idea is that we're to see ourselves many times in their shoes. Why didn't they get it? Jesus teaches very plainly, and they don't get it. And so it's this theme of the 12 as failed disciples. And Mark pictures the journey, it's a transformative journey from up in the north of Palestine, of Caesarea Philippi, around the Sea of Galilee, as the journey goes to Jerusalem. And he's going to Jerusalem to die. And Mark's account of the failed discipleship of the 12 is a warning to all who hear his gospel or read this narrative. And to journey with Jesus, Jesus very plainly told them he's going to the cross. And we would like to avoid the implications of bearing the cross as well. And so, is it the idea that they're just so dull they don't get it, or the idea is they don't want to follow in the steps of Jesus because he's going to the cross? So very early on, Mark records that Jesus went up to a mountain and he called to him those whom he wanted. They came to him and he appointed 12 whom he named apostles, and they're to be his representatives, his proxy. They have special instruction. Well, we might think, well, if they have special instruction, then they're going to get it. But in Mark 6:52, Mark records that the disciples' hearts were hardened. And Jesus even questioned them, do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to see? Or do you not remember in Mark chapter 8, 17 and 18? And so the general background in Mark is that the 12 failed Jesus and they failed him miserably. And the idea is to present to us that many times we're like them. And all that becomes very specific as they journey from Caesarea Philippi as they're going to Jerusalem. And Mark frames that journey with on both ends with the healing of a blind man in Galilee. That's before it began in chapter 8, 22 through 26. And then in Jericho of Judea in Mark 10, 46 through 52 is the healing of another blind man. And so to put blind men on both ends of this and then have the 12 as they're journeying with Jesus is to say they're also blind in a sense. And there is a structure to this. Jesus tells them that he's going to die. He tells them very specifically what is going to happen. So there is a prophecy from Jesus. Then there's a reaction from the 12, from the apostles. And then there is a response from Jesus. And these are warnings. And there are 3 of these that lead up until he gets to Jerusalem. The first one, we're not going to be able to read all of this in depth, but the first one is in Mark 8. So go back to Mark 8 and verse 31. And the journey starts. And in 8, he began, so right before this, in Caesarea Philippi, he asked, who do people say that I am? And he questioned his disciples, and they told him, John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some the others, and continued questioning them. And Peter said, he said, who do you say that I am? And Peter said, you are the Christ. Then look at verse 30. And he warned them not to tell anyone about him. I mean, why is that? Because they don't know enough to tell. And that's going to come out in what follows. Because verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise from the dead. There's the prophecy. That's what's going to happen, he says. What is their reaction? Verse 32, and he was stating the matter plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. That's the reaction to that. And what's Jesus' response? Verse 33, by turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not setting your mind on God's purposes, but on man's." And we might think, well, that's just a private thing, but look at verse 34. He summoned a crowd together with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Jesus is going to the cross. So if you follow Jesus, you have to take up the cross and follow him. So you have the prophecy, the reaction, and then the response from Jesus. And what this is showing is they didn't get it. They failed it. And the second warning is in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. So go over there. Again, we don't have time to read all this in depth, but Mark chapter 9, verse 30. So there's prophecy, there's the disciples' reaction, and then there's Jesus' response. So in 9:30, from there they went on and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later." There's the prophecy. Verse 32, here's their response. What's their response? But they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. And Jesus, even as they're traveling along, they're in the house, and he began to question them, "What are you discussing on the way?" And it turns out that they're discussing who's going to be great, who's going to be the greatest. So he calls the 12, and he says, if anybody wants to be first, he shall be last. That's his response. You have to follow me in humility. Even as Jesus is plainly announcing his death in Jerusalem, they're debating who's first, who's going to be first among us. The third warning is in Mark chapter 10. Go over there, beginning with verse 32. And they're getting closer to Jerusalem. And 32 says, now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. The word for road in Greek and the word for way is the same word. And so it's the way of the cross. It is the road to Jerusalem. And remember, he said, if anybody follows me, you have to take up your cross and follow me. Jesus is walking on ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. They're fearful because he's told them, I'm going to die, and I'll be rejected. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him. So here's the prophecy. Now listen to this one, because this is so very, very in-depth. Jesus knows what's going to happen. He's not surprised. He's not caught by surprise. Verse 33. Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will flog him and spit on him, or mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. That's the most in-depth prophecy that Jesus gives out of these three. In fact, it's so in-depth that it is an outline in Mark's gospel of what does happen. Let me just run through this real quick. He says he will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes. In Mark 14:10 and 11, it says that Judas Iscariot went to the chief priest in order to, and the translations have betray, but the literal is handed over. And so Judas is making plans to hand over Jesus. Jesus says they will condemn him to death. Mark 14:63 and 64. The high priest tore his clothes and said, "You've heard blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him, deserving death. That's Scripture. That's what it says happened. Jesus said it would happen. That's what happened. He said they will hand him over to the Gentiles. Mark 15, verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Jesus said that will happen. They will mock him. 15:20. After mocking him, they stripped off the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him and spit on him. Mark 15:19. They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and flogged him. Mark 15:15. Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. And they will kill him. Mark 15:24. They crucified him. And then he says, and after 3 days, he will rise again. In Mark 16:6, when the women come to the tomb, they're told, do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. There's the place where they laid him. Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen, and he's prophesying, and he's telling the 12 about this, and they don't get it. Their reaction is they don't get it. The idea is Mark is showing, are we like them? And then Jesus responds with the idea, I don't see why your hearts are hardened. And so it happens every time. Yet after this prophecy, each of these prophecies, Mark records the failure of the disciples. I mean, this time here in Mark 10, look at 32 and following, we saw specifically what Jesus said. Then look at verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus and said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? Now listen, it's a very clear prophecy from Jesus about his suffering and what's going to happen. And this is their response, their reaction. We want you to do for us what we ask of you. And then here's what it is, verse 37. Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. Now notice Jesus says you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? And you remember when we get into the garden in the Gethsemane, Jesus prays that this cup be taken from me. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism which I'm baptized? And then they say, we are able. And Jesus says, the cup that I drink, you shall drink. You shall be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, it's not mine to give. It's for those it has been prepared. So that's the response of Jesus, this failure every time among the 12. And throughout this, he's illustrating humility. One time, he brings a little child, sits in front of him, and he says, whoever wants to be first must be last. Whoever welcomes a child in my name welcomes me. He also says in response, in Mark 10, 42 through 45, you know that the Gentiles, they rule over with might, with power. But it's not to be so among you. You must be a servant. You must serve. So Mark is criticizing the 12, but it's the idea is he wants his readers, he wants us to see that we're like them a lot of times. And yet, as we go back now to Mark 14, he records this incident here, which is not like the 12. It's somebody that's not like the 12. It's somebody who really gets it. It's this woman, and they get upset over that because she wasted, that's 300 denarii worth. And you remember, we've talked about before, a denarii is a pay for a worker for 1 day. So 300 denarii is 300 days' pay. It's about a year's worth of pay, of salary. That's what this is worth. And she broke the vial and she poured the perfume on his head. Now, they're indignant. They're angry. Why has this perfume been wasted? It could have been sold and the money given to the poor. And Jesus basically says, you have the poor all the time. Is that what you're worrying about? Is that really it? Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She's done a good deed for me. Now, why is she praised so highly? Look at verse 8. She's done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. And wherever the gospel is preached, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. She's anointed my body for the burial. What's Jesus been telling the 12 over and over? I'm going to be crucified, I'll be buried, I'll be raised on the third day. But he's going to die. And they don't get it. Each time they don't get it because they're worried about, their honor, where they're going to be. So in a sense, the 12 fail, but this woman believes it because she's anointed his body for the burial. So she's the first believer in this. And that's the contrast. It's a graphic demonstration. And so then the third part of the frame, it comes back to the 12. Look again, verse 10. Judas, who's one of the 12, he's the one that betrays. So there's a contrast between a believer, the unnamed woman, and then the betrayer. And so look at 10 and 11 again. We have the appearance of the traitor. That closes the frame because the Jewish leaders need a traitor. How are we going to do this? And then the traitor appears. And he is Judas, and he's one of the 12. But in the middle of this is this woman who gets it that Jesus is going to die, that he's going to be buried, he's going to be raised, but she anoints his body for his burial. Now, Mark doesn't give a hint at money as being part of Judas' motive. The other Gospels do. He carried the money bag. And in Greek, there's a play on that. To carry something, you have to lift it. So, if I'm going to carry that, I'll lift it. He lifted the money bag. He not only carried the money bag, he lifted the money bag. And we have the idea of shoplifting today. So he lifted from the money bag. He carried the money bag, but he lifted the money bag. Money, greed was part of this motivation. And in the other Gospels as well, Mark records here when she broke that perfume, and it says, verse 4, there were some indignantly remarking to one another. In the other Gospels, we're told at least one of those of the group of the some, and that's Judas. And John explains to us in John 12 and verse 6, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse, and he used to steal what was put into it. John also ties this in with the devil. It says in John 13:2, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. In 13:27, after he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, do quickly what you're going to do. So his betrayal is an example of how the closest to Jesus failed him. He didn't recover. The others failed him as well, but their hearts were tender and they responded. So, but Judas is an example. It shows close proximity to Jesus doesn't necessarily mean that you are a believer. And the woman is a great example of someone who does get it, who's going to follow. And so Mark puts these two as contrast, not as the other frames we've seen where one explains the other, but there's a great contrast. A traitor versus a believer. And so the question spiritually for us is, are we this woman or are we Judas? Are we the 12? Are we following Jesus to the cross? We're going to sing 31 that Steve announced as the invitation song. Almost Persuaded. If you're not a Christian this morning, we call you to respond, to follow Jesus to the cross. Judas didn't start out as the betrayer. I mean, you look at a lot of pictures of the Last Supper, and you see them sitting around the table. You can always pick out Judas. He's the mean-looking one in the artist's mind. And I don't think it would be so easy to pick out Judas, because you remember when Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me? And they all said, is it I? Is it I? They didn't all say, who's it going to be? Judas? I always thought it was going to be Judas. They said, is it I? Is it I? And so Judas didn't start out as the betrayer, but he allowed Satan to enter his heart, and he didn't follow what Jesus was saying. Are we like this unnamed woman, or are we like Judas? So if you're not a Christian, we call you to trust what Jesus said. He did die for our sins, and he was raised, and he offers life to us. He calls us to repent, to confess, and be immersed. If you've done that, you've wandered away, you're in dangerous territory. Are you going to come back, or are you going to be confirmed in that like Judas? And so it's our prayer today. If you need to come, you'll do that while we stand and sing.